The first thing Emma Carter noticed about Forward Operating Base Red Mesa wasn't the heat. It was the silence. Not the kind that came from peace. This silence lived between conversations. It settled over the motor pool every time she walked past a row of mechanics covered in grease and dust. Wrenches kept turning, engines kept running. But jokes stopped halfway through, and eyes followed her until she disappeared behind another armored vehicle. By noon on her first day, everyone knew there was a woman assigned to the maintenance platoon. By evening, everyone seemed to have an opinion. Emma climbed down from the transport truck carrying a duffel bag in one hand and a weathered metal toolbox in the other. At 26, she looked younger than most of the soldiers already stationed at the base. She wasn't especially tall, and the desert wind kept blowing loose strands of brown hair from beneath her patrol cap. The sun hadn't been up long, yet sweat already clung to the back of her uniform. Rows of M1 Abrams tanks stretched across the motor pool like sleeping giants. Their sand-colored armor blended with the endless desert beyond the wire. Some crews were cleaning tracks. Others checked radios or loaded supplies. The air smelled of diesel fuel, hydraulic fluid, and hot metal baking beneath the relentless sun. Emma paused for a moment. She had always loved this place. Not the desert itself, but what a maintenance yard represented. Every vehicle carried a story. Every scratch in the armor meant someone had come home. Every repaired engine meant another crew could trust their machine when everything depended on it. That was why she had joined the Army. Not because she dreamed of firing a tank, because she wanted to keep them moving. A stocky staff sergeant approached with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. "You Carter?" "Yes, Staff Sergeant." "I'm Staff Sergeant Miller." His handshake was firm but brief. "Follow me." As they crossed the motor pool, Miller pointed toward different maintenance bays. "Recovery section over there. Welding shop behind those containers. Parts warehouse across the yard." Emma listened carefully, memorizing everything. "You worked Abrams before?" 3 years, Staff Sergeant." He nodded without much interest. "We'll see." That was all. No questions about her previous assignment. No curiosity about why she'd transferred. Just 2 words. "We'll see." Inside the maintenance bay, half a dozen mechanics worked around a tank with its rear engine compartment open. Someone glanced up. Another nudged the mechanic beside him. Within seconds, the entire shop knew she had arrived. One of them wiped grease from his hands onto an already filthy rag. "So that's our reinforcement?" Another chuckled. "I thought they were sending another diesel guy." "Nah," someone answered. "Looks like they sent us a recruiter." A few laughed. Emma pretended not to hear. She had heard versions of the same jokes before. Different base, different faces, same assumptions. Staff Sergeant Miller clapped his hands. "Listen up." The conversation stopped. "This is Specialist Emma Carter. She'll be working maintenance with 2nd Section." Silence. Then someone in the back muttered just loudly enough to hear. "Guess somebody's got to organize the toolbox." More laughter. Miller didn't smile. He also didn't correct them. "You'll be reporting to Sergeant Blake." A tall mechanic stepped forward. Sergeant Nathan Blake looked to be in his late 30s. Years of working around armored vehicles had left deep lines across his forehead and permanent stains on his hands that no amount of soap could remove. He studied Emma for several seconds. "You ever pull an AGT-1500 turbine?" "Yes, Sergeant." "By yourself?" "With a maintenance team." He looked unconvinced. "We work fast around here." "I understand. No shortcuts." "I don't take shortcuts." He gave a small nod. "We'll find out." Emma spent the morning helping inspect one of the battalion's Abrams tanks, scheduled for a field exercise later that week. She worked quietly, methodically. She checked fluid levels, electrical connectors, hydraulic lines, drive sprockets, fuel filters, track tension. Most mechanics developed habits after years in the field. Some skipped steps they considered unnecessary. Others trusted experience over technical manuals. Emma trusted patterns. Machines always talked. Most people simply didn't listen. She removed an oil filter and held it toward the light. Tiny metallic particles sparkled inside the remaining oil. Not many. Enough to notice. She frowned. Everything good? The voice belonged to Private First Class Luis Ramirez, a young mechanic barely out of training. Emma tilted the filter. See these? He leaned closer. They're tiny. They are. So, normal? Sometimes. She reached into her toolbox and removed a small inspection magnet. Within seconds, fine metallic dust clung to it. Ramirez watched carefully. Is that bad? It depends. She looked toward the open engine compartment. One filter isn't enough to tell the story. By lunch, Emma had inspected 3 more tanks. Each showed nearly identical traces. Not severe enough to ground the vehicle. Not yet, but similar enough to catch her attention. She walked across the maintenance bay, carrying her notebook. Sergeant Blake looked up from a workbench. What have you got? I've found light metallic contamination in multiple engine oil filters. He shrugged. Expected. It could be. Emma opened the notebook. But all 4 vehicles also show slight fuel pressure fluctuations. Blake looked over without taking the notebook. They're old tanks. These readings weren't present in the previous maintenance logs. You already read all those? Yes. When? Last night. One mechanic nearby laughed. Couldn't sleep. Emma ignored him. Blake finally accepted the notebook. He skimmed 1 page, then another. His expression never changed. You think 4 tanks are about to lose engines? No. She chose her words carefully. I think they may be developing the same problem. What problem? I don't know yet. Someone behind them snorted. That's helpful. Blake handed the notebook back. Keep watching them. Should we inspect the fuel system seals? They passed inspection. I know. Then leave them. Emma hesitated. They're showing the same early signs. We're preparing 43 vehicles for a deployment exercise. I understand. We don't start tearing apart operational tanks because one specialist has a feeling. She nodded once. Understood, Sergeant. He returned to work. Conversation resumed almost immediately. One mechanic spoke quietly, believing she couldn't hear. Book smart, another answered. Doesn't mean she knows tanks. That evening, long after most soldiers had headed toward the dining facility, Emma remained in the motor pool. The temperature finally began to fall. Shadows stretched across rows of armored vehicles. She sat on an overturned crate beside one Abrams, maintenance manual spread open across her knees. Private Ramirez walked over carrying 2 paper cups. Coffee? She smiled. Thanks. He handed her one. You really think something's wrong? Emma looked toward the parked tanks. I think something doesn't make sense. Like what? The symptoms. He sat nearby. They're too similar. Ramirez frowned. Could just be coincidence. Maybe. She wasn't offended by the suggestion. Good mechanics questioned conclusions. So why keep looking? Emma wrapped both hands around the warm cup. When I was 16, my dad rebuilt an old pickup truck. Ramirez waited. He told me something I've never forgotten. What? Machines almost never fail without warning. She smiled faintly. People just ignore the warning because the machine still works. Ramirez nodded slowly. My father used to say trucks could smell fear. Emma laughed. I don't think engines can smell anything. Maybe not. He stood. You staying late? For a while. You trying to prove something? Emma looked across the quiet motor pool where dozens of armored vehicles rested beneath the fading orange sky. No, she answered so softly that Ramirez almost missed it. I'm trying to make sure these crews all come back. After he walked away, Emma climbed once more onto the rear deck of the nearest Abrams. She removed another inspection panel, checked another line, recorded another pressure reading. The pattern was still there. Small, consistent, easy to dismiss. The distant sound of tank engines echoed across the desert as another company returned from evening maneuvers. Emma closed her notebook and watched the vehicles roll through the gate one by one. dust hanging behind them like a fading curtain. Somewhere inside those machines was a problem no one else believed existed. She couldn't prove it yet, but she had learned long ago that ignoring a quiet warning was often the fastest way to create a very loud disaster. 3 mornings later, the motor pool came alive long before sunrise. Portable floodlights illuminated rows of Abrams tanks, while mechanics moved between them carrying toolboxes, diagnostic equipment, and stacks of maintenance forms. The battalion's week-long desert maneuver was less than 48 hours away, and every vehicle had to be mission-ready before first light. Emma had been awake since 4. By the time most of the maintenance section arrived, she had already completed inspections on 2 recovery vehicles and reviewed the previous day's engine reports. She noticed the same pattern again. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would immediately ground a tank. Just small irregularities that refused to disappear. Fuel pressure dipped for a fraction of a second during heavy acceleration. Turbine temperatures climbed a little faster than expected. Oil samples contained almost identical traces of microscopic metallic particles. Individually, none of those signs justified replacing major components. Together, they bothered her. She walked toward Sergeant Blake, who was reviewing maintenance schedules on the hood of a Humvee. "Sergeant?" Without looking up, he answered, "Morning. I'd like another look at the fuel supply records." "What for?" "I think I've narrowed down where the contamination starts." That finally caught his attention. "You figured that out already?" "I have a theory." Blake folded his arms. "Let's hear it." Emma opened her notebook. The affected tanks all received scheduled maintenance within the same 2-week period. "So?" "They were serviced by different mechanics." "Correct." "They used different fueling points." "Yes." She pointed to several maintenance entries. "But every one of them received replacement fuel system seals from the same supply shipment." Blake stared at the page. Emma continued. "If those seals have a manufacturing defect, desert heat could cause them to slowly break down. You think rubber seals are destroying turbine engines? I'm saying tiny particles could be entering the fuel system. And causing all this? They're small enough to avoid routine inspections, but large enough to interfere with fuel delivery under heavy load." For a moment, Blake actually considered it. Then he shook his head. "That's a stretch. I'd like permission to inspect one." "We don't have time. It would take less than an hour. We've got 43 vehicles to certify." Emma remained calm. "If I'm wrong, we lose an hour. And if you're right, we prevent a breakdown later." Blake sighed. "I appreciate initiative, Carter." His tone softened slightly. "But you're building a case from assumptions." "I'm building it from evidence." He handed her notebook back. "Keep documenting." Then he walked away. The conversation left Emma frustrated, not because Blake had disagreed, but because he hadn't truly looked. She understood pressure. The battalion was on a strict schedule. Exercises couldn't simply be delayed because one mechanic had concerns. Still, she couldn't ignore what she was seeing. Instead of arguing, she returned to work. Throughout the morning, she crawled beneath tanks, checked fittings, examined filters, and compared serial numbers. Private Ramirez noticed her writing down every replacement part. "You catalog everything?" She smiled. "My dad used to joke that my notebooks knew more than I did." Ramirez laughed. "Looks exhausting." "It saves arguments." "How?" "Memory changes." She tapped the notebook. "This doesn't." Late that afternoon, Emma visited the parts warehouse. Rows of shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, stacked with carefully labeled boxes. Behind the counter sat Sergeant Olivia Hughes, the supply NCO. "You look like you're hunting something specific," Hughes said. "I need records from shipment Delta 7. Hughes raised an eyebrow. "That's pretty specific." "I know." A few minutes later, several boxes sat on the counter. Emma carefully compared lot numbers. Her heartbeat quickened. Every questionable tank had received seals from exactly the same manufacturing batch. Everyone. She opened one unopened package. At first glance, the seal looked perfectly normal. Flexible, clean, proper dimensions. But, under magnification, tiny cracks had already begun forming around the inner edge. She gently bent the material. The surface whitened slightly. Too brittle. Far too brittle for new components. Hughes frowned. "That doesn't look right." Emma nodded. "It isn't." Within the hour, she was back inside Sergeant Blake's office. He looked tired. "Carter." She placed 2 seals on his desk. "These came from the same shipment." He picked one up. "So?" "They're deteriorating. They're brand new. They shouldn't crack when flexed." He bent one slightly. Tiny white stress marks appeared. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. "You sure?" "I checked 3 unopened packages. Could be storage. They've been climate controlled." Blake leaned back. "What exactly are you recommending?" "Replace every seal from this batch before deployment." He stared at her. "Do you know how many vehicles that is?" 21. "And how many labor hours?" "Roughly 90. He gave a humorless laugh. "The colonel launches this exercise tomorrow." "I know. You want me to tell him we're delaying because of rubber seals?" Emma didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said quietly, "I'd rather explain a delay than explain why tanks stopped moving during an operation." Blake rubbed his forehead. "I'll bring it up." That evening, senior maintenance leaders gathered inside the operations building. Emma wasn't invited. She spent the time finishing inspections while trying not to wonder what was being said. An hour later, Blake returned. His face revealed the answer before he spoke. "They're not replacing them." Emma remained silent. "Command says risk is acceptable." "Did they examine the samples?" "They looked. And they believe current inspection standards are sufficient." She nodded slowly. "So we proceed." "We proceed." Blake hesitated. "For what it's worth." He searched for the right words. "You presented your case professionally." Emma offered a small smile. "Thank you." "You disappointed?" "A little." "You think they're making a mistake?" She looked toward the rows of tanks outside. "I hope I'm wrong." The next day, the battalion prepared to move. Crews loaded ammunition, water, fuel, and recovery equipment. Radio checks echoed across the staging area. Engines roared to life one after another. Emma watched mechanics loading spare parts into maintenance trucks. Then she quietly walked to the supply cage. Without fanfare, she checked out several replacement seal kits from a different production batch. She added extra fuel fittings, additional filters, precision cleaning tools, inspection mirrors, a portable pressure tester, Private Ramirez noticed. "That's more than the checklist." "It is." "You expecting trouble?" Emma secured another toolbox. "I'm preparing for possibilities." He grinned. "You always this cautious?" "My father called it pessimistic." "And you?" "I call it being responsible." Ramirez helped load the final case. "If nothing breaks, then we'll bring everything home unopened." "And if something does?" Emma closed the compartment door. "We won't waste time wishing we'd packed it." As the sun climbed higher, dozens of Abrams tanks rolled through the front gate in formation. Their tracks churned sand into thick clouds that drifted across the desert floor. Recovery vehicles followed, fuel trucks, maintenance teams, command vehicles. The enormous column stretched for nearly a mile. Emma climbed into the maintenance recovery vehicle assigned to follow the armored companies. She adjusted her headset and looked through the windshield at the tanks disappearing into the shimmering heat. Something still felt wrong. She couldn't explain it. The evidence in her notebook pointed toward a problem no one believed urgent enough to fix. Now those same vehicles were heading into one of the harshest environments imaginable, where blistering temperatures, constant vibration, and heavy engine loads would push every component to its limits. Beside her, Ramirez noticed she was unusually quiet. "Nervous?" Emma watched the lead tanks become small silhouettes against the endless horizon. "Not nervous." She tightened the strap on her helmet. "Just hoping the desert proves me wrong." The convoy pressed deeper into the open wasteland, the sound of dozens of turbine engines rolling across the sand like distant thunder. Emma rested one hand on the toolbox at her feet. the one filled with replacement seals that no one thought they would need. She hoped it would stay closed for the entire mission, but she couldn't shake the feeling that before long, every tool inside it would matter. The exercise began exactly as planned. For the first 2 days, the battalion moved across the desert with practiced precision. Tank companies advanced in formation, infantry fighting vehicles secured the flanks, and aviation units occasionally passed overhead in coordinated support. Every movement was timed, every radio transmission measured and deliberate. Emma spent most of those days riding in the M88 recovery vehicle with the maintenance section, responding to routine service calls. A loose hydraulic fitting, a damaged road wheel, one faulty communications connector. Nothing unusual. By the evening of the second day, even she began to wonder if she had worried over nothing. Ramirez noticed the change. "Looks like your notebook loses this round." Emma smiled while tightening a fuel line on a support truck. "I'd be happy if it did. You really don't mind being wrong? I'd rather be embarrassed than attend someone's memorial service." Ramirez stopped smiling. After spending 2 days beside her, he understood she never spoke dramatically. If Emma Carter said something, she meant every word. Just after dawn on the third morning, the battalion received new orders. A reconnaissance drone had detected an armed enemy force moving through a series of dry valleys several miles east of their planned route. Intelligence believed the hostile unit intended to ambush supply convoys operating in the region. Instead of continuing the scheduled exercise, the battalion was ordered to intercept and secure the area before the enemy could establish firing positions. The atmosphere changed immediately. Maps replaced training schedules. Live ammunition replaced blanks. Voices over the radio became shorter, sharper, professional. This was no longer a rehearsal. Emma tightened the strap of her helmet as the maintenance convoy fell into position behind the armored companies. She had deployed before, but every operation carried the same quiet uncertainty. No amount of preparation erased it. By mid-morning, the heat had become relentless. The horizon shimmered beneath a white sky. Dust poured behind every vehicle, limiting visibility to only a few hundred yards. Inside the recovery vehicle, warning reports crackled over the radio. "Lead company approaching Objective Falcon. Copy. Scouts report no visual contact." Then, the first explosion erupted. A plume of sand and smoke burst nearly 50 feet into the air ahead of the column. "Contact!" The radio exploded with overlapping voices. "Incoming! Missile launch, left ridge. Move! Move!" Enemy rockets streaked across the valley. Machine gun fire echoed from rocky outcroppings overlooking the narrow pass. The lead tanks immediately accelerated, rotating their turrets toward the ridgeline. The desert, silent only seconds earlier, became a storm of thunder. Emma grabbed the dashboard as the recovery vehicle swerved behind a rocky embankment. Dust filled the air. Another explosion shook the ground. Ramirez looked toward her. "This isn't an exercise anymore." "No," Emma answered calmly. "It isn't." The battalion reacted exactly as it had trained. Forward tanks pushed toward covered positions. Infantry dismounted. Artillery requests flooded command channels. Within minutes, the enemy's initial ambush began losing momentum. Then another voice came across the radio. "Alpha 1, losing engine power. Static. Repeat. Engine warning. Reduced output." Emma's head lifted immediately. A second transmission followed less than 30 seconds later. Bravo 3 experiencing power loss. Then another. Charlie 2 slowing. Another. Alpha 4 warning lights. Her stomach tightened. Not one tank. Several. Almost simultaneously. Ramirez looked at her. "Emma, I know. The pattern. Exactly the pattern." Colonel Davis stood outside his command vehicle watching through binoculars as the armored column struggled to maintain momentum. "What is happening?" a maintenance officer answered. "Unknown mechanical failures, sir." "How many?" "4 confirmed." As if on cue, another transmission interrupted. 5. The colonel lowered the binoculars. "That's impossible. Healthy Abrams tanks did not simply fail together. not unless something connected them. Emma didn't wait to be told. She grabbed her diagnostic kit and sprinted toward the first disabled tank. Its crew had already climbed onto the rear deck. Smoke shimmered above the turbine exhaust. Sergeant Blake was there before her. "We're checking the engine." Emma shook her head. "No." "What?" "It isn't the engine." "We don't know that." "I do." Blake stared at her. "Open the fuel assembly." "We're under fire." "Exactly. If we pull the turbine, we don't have time." Another explosion landed nearby. Sand rained across the tank. Emma climbed onto the engine deck and removed the inspection cover herself. Blake hesitated only a second before helping. Within moments, she reached the primary seal. It crumbled slightly beneath her fingers, exactly as she feared. Tiny fragments had entered the fuel delivery system. She looked directly at Blake. "This is it." His expression changed. No argument, no skepticism, only realization. "We need replacement seals," Emma shouted. Ramirez immediately understood. "The recovery truck." "I packed them." He ran. Blake looked almost stunned. "You actually brought extras?" "I hoped I'd never need them." While bullets snapped against distant rocks, Emma worked with astonishing focus. She ignored the explosions, ignored the shouting, ignored everything except the damaged assembly beneath her hands. Years of repetition took over. Remove, clean, flush, replace, reconnect, pressure test, prime. She moved so efficiently that even Blake struggled to keep pace. What next? Fuel line. He handed it over before she finished speaking. Filter. Already there. Pressure gauge. Ramirez had it waiting. The crew around her stopped asking questions. They simply followed instructions. 5 minutes later, Emma climbed down. "Start it." The tank commander looked uncertain. "Now." He pressed the ignition. For one long second, nothing. Then the turbine whined. The engine roared back to life. Every soldier nearby turned toward the sound. The tank commander looked at Emma in disbelief. "It's running." She was already gathering her tools. "Good." She pointed farther down the stalled column. "We've got 4 more." As she reached the second disabled tank, Sergeant Blake grabbed her arm. "You were right." Emma looked at him briefly. "This isn't the time." He released her immediately. "Understood." For the first time since she had arrived at Red Mesa, there wasn't a trace of doubt in his voice. Only trust. The second repair took 4 minutes. The third took less than 4. By the 4th vehicle, mechanics from every maintenance team had surrounded Emma. "What do we replace?" "These seals." "What about the turbine?" "Leave it." "What do we clean?" She pointed rapidly. "Fuel inlet. Primary line. Replace the filter. Flush everything before restart." The mechanics repeated her instructions to one another. Within minutes, multiple repair teams were working simultaneously. The knowledge she had fought so hard to share before the mission was now spreading across the battlefield at incredible speed. Not through meetings. Not through paperwork. Through action. Then, the radio came alive again. "Enemy vehicles moving around the southern ridge." The battalion commander looked toward the immobilized section of the column. "If those tanks don't move..." No one finished the sentence. Everyone understood. The stalled vehicles blocked the narrow valley. If they remained there, the entire battalion would become trapped under enemy fire. Emma wiped grease from her hands. "One more." She ran toward the final disabled Abrams. Halfway there, another explosion struck nearby. The shock wave threw her to one knee. Ramirez rushed toward her. "You okay?" She looked down. A shallow cut on her forearm. Nothing more. "I'm fine." "You sure?" Emma picked up the wrench she had dropped. "We're wasting time." She stood and kept running. Behind her, Sergeant Blake watched in silence. Only days earlier, many of the mechanics had laughed at the young woman who insisted that tiny cracks in inexpensive seals could threaten an entire battalion. Now, hardened soldiers twice her age were following her instructions without hesitation, because every repaired tank was proof that she had seen what the rest of them had missed. Ahead, the last disabled Abrams sat motionless in the middle of the valley, smoke drifting from its engine compartment as enemy fire echoed across the surrounding hills. Emma climbed onto the rear deck, opened her toolbox, and reached for the final replacement seal. The battle was far from over. But for the first time since the ambush began, the battalion had a chance to fight its way forward instead of being trapped where it stood. Emma slid the last replacement seal into place with hands that refused to shake. The tank crew stood around her, providing what cover they could while rounds cracked across the valley. Dust drifted over the engine compartment, mixing with grease until every tool felt coated in fine grit. "Pressure line," she said. The driver handed it over before she had to ask twice. "Filter." Already waiting. She tightened the final fitting and stepped back. "Start her." The turbine hesitated for only a heartbeat before its familiar whine rose above the gunfire. The engine settled into a smooth, steady roar. The commander gave her a quick thumbs up through the open hatch. "We're back." Emma allowed herself one slow breath. "Move out." The Abrams lurched forward, clearing the bottleneck that had trapped the battalion. Almost immediately, more tanks began rolling behind it. The valley that had seemed hopelessly clogged only minutes earlier slowly came back to life. Colonel Davis watched through binoculars from the command vehicle. "Report." The operations officer smiled for the first time since the ambush began. "The column's moving again, sir." "Cause?" Specialist Carter identified a failed seal in the fuel system. Maintenance teams are replacing them across the battalion. The colonel lowered the binoculars. "The same specialist who filed those maintenance concerns?" "Yes, sir." He didn't say anything for several seconds. Instead, he picked up the radio. "All companies, continue advancing. Recovery teams have restored mobility. Push through the valley." One by one, acknowledgments came back. The enemy clearly hadn't expected the armored column to recover so quickly. Another volley of rockets streaked across the desert, but this time the tanks were moving. Abrams that had been sitting helplessly moments before now spread into firing positions. Their main guns thundered one after another. The ridgeline erupted in clouds of smoke and shattered rock. Infantry squads advanced behind the armor, using the restored tanks as moving shields. The balance of the fight began to shift. Emma finally looked around. Only then did she realize how exhausted everyone was. Ramirez sat beside the recovery vehicle drinking water with trembling hands. His face was streaked with dirt. "You should sit down," he told her. She glanced toward the advancing tanks. "We're not finished." Before he could answer, another radio call came in. "Recovery Team 2, respond to Echo Company." Ramirez groaned. "Another breakdown?" Emma listened carefully. "No? What?" "Track damage." He smiled with relief. "I've never been so happy to hear someone through a track." The recovery vehicle bounced across uneven ground toward Echo Company. A damaged Abrams sat behind a low ridge. One of its tracks twisted after striking debris during the advance. Compared to what they had just survived, the repair was straightforward. Still, enemy fire continued in the distance. The battlefield remained dangerous. Emma knelt beside the damaged suspension while two crewmen helped remove the broken section. One of them, a broad-shouldered sergeant named Collins, looked at her for a moment. "I owe you an apology." Emma kept working. "For what?" "I figured they sent us someone who'd slow us down." She loosened another retaining pin. "You weren't the only one." "No." He shook his head. "I wasn't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Collins said quietly, "My crew's alive because our tank moved." Emma looked up. "You kept fighting. We couldn't have if you'd quit." She simply nodded and returned to work. By late afternoon, organized resistance from the enemy had begun to collapse. Attack helicopters arrived overhead, forcing hostile vehicles to withdraw deeper into the surrounding hills. Artillery fire grew less frequent. Radio traffic became calmer. The battalion had regained control of the valley. Medical teams moved among the vehicles, treating minor injuries. Recovery crews collected damaged equipment. Mechanics, including many who had doubted Emma only days earlier, continued replacing defective seals whenever another vehicle stopped for inspection. Nobody questioned the work anymore. If Emma recommended a replacement, it happened. Immediately. As the sun started dropping toward the horizon, Sergeant Blake walked over carrying Emma's notebook. She frowned. "I thought I left that in the recovery truck." "You did." He handed it to her carefully. "I found it under your seat." She checked it instinctively. Every page was still there. Every observation, every maintenance record, every warning she had written before the deployment. Blake looked toward the tanks lining the valley. "I should have listened." Emma remained quiet. "I've been doing this for 16 years, he continued. "Long enough to think experience meant I'd seen everything." He gave a tired smile. "You reminded me that experience only matters if you're still willing to learn." Emma closed the notebook. "We all miss things." "No." He shook his head. "You found it. I couldn't prove it. You tried." He looked directly at her. "I won't forget that." As darkness settled over the desert, maintenance crews established a temporary service area beside the secured valley. Portable lights illuminated rows of battle-worn tanks. Some bore fresh scorch marks, others carried dents from shrapnel. Nearly all of them still ran. Emma sat on the lowered ramp of the recovery vehicle, finally removing her gloves. Her hands were blistered. Her forearms ached. Grease covered almost every inch of her uniform. Ramirez walked over carrying 2 meal packets. "I think this qualifies as dinner." She accepted one with a tired smile. "You know," he said, "when you first showed up," Emma raised an eyebrow, "you thought I organized toolboxes." He laughed. "I was going to say I thought you were too quiet. And now?" Ramirez looked across the rows of tanks. "Now I think quiet people are the ones I should pay attention to." Emma looked out at the armored battalion resting beneath the desert stars. The engines that rumbled softly through the night sounded different now. Not because the machines had changed, because every one of those familiar sounds reminded her that another crew would be driving home instead of being stranded on a battlefield. For a mechanic, there was no greater reward than hearing an engine come back to life. And tonight, across the desert, dozens of them were still running. The convoy returned to forward operating base Red Mesa just after sunrise. Dust-covered tanks rolled through the gates in staggered formation, their engines still warm from the desert night. Some vehicles were missing paint from armor edges. Others carried fresh welding marks where field repairs had held under pressure. Every single one, however, was moving under its own power. That alone told the story before anyone spoke. Emma sat in the recovery vehicle as it crossed the threshold of the motor pool. Her posture was still, but exhaustion had settled deep into her body. She hadn't properly slept in nearly 2 days. Ramirez glanced at her. "You realize you didn't sit down once after the first tank?" "I sat," Emma replied. "That doesn't count." A faint smile passed across her face. It counted at the time. The motor pool was already crowded with personnel waiting for debrief and maintenance review. What had once been casual noise and joking now felt different. Quieter, more deliberate. Soldiers watched the returning vehicles with a kind of restrained focus, as if they were seeing them differently than before. Because they were. Sergeant Blake stepped forward as Emma climbed down from the recovery vehicle. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he simply said, "Report." Emma handed him her field notes. All vehicles accounted for, 21 seal replacements completed under combat conditions, 3 additional fuel system flushes, 6 emergency repairs unrelated to the seal failure. Blake scanned the pages. Every entry was precise. Every timestamp matched radio logs. Every action documented under fire. He closed the notebook slowly. "Command wants to see you." Emma nodded. Inside the operations building, the battalion commander stood with several senior officers. Colonel Davis looked up as Emma entered. "Specialist Carter." "Sir." He gestured toward a map still pinned with markers from the operation. "This battalion was positioned to complete a movement exercise. Instead, we walked into an armed engagement and lost mobility in the middle of a kill zone." He paused. Explain what happened. Emma didn't hesitate. Sir, the fuel system seals supplied in shipment Delta 7 were defective. Under desert heat and sustained load, they degraded and introduced contamination into the fuel lines. That contamination caused simultaneous engine performance failures across multiple vehicles. One of the officers frowned. And you identified this before deployment? Yes, sir. Why wasn't it addressed? Emma chose her words carefully. It was assessed as low probability by maintenance leadership. Silence followed. Colonel Davis studied her for a long moment. Then he turned to Blake. Is that accurate? Blake didn't look away. Yes, sir. The colonel exhaled slowly. We could have lost this battalion. No one argued, because everyone in that room had seen the valley, had seen how quickly armored strength could turn into immobility when systems failed at the wrong time. He looked back at Emma. You kept these vehicles moving under fire. I followed procedures, sir. A faint, almost tired expression crossed his face. No, he corrected gently. You adapted when procedures weren't enough. Later that morning, maintenance personnel gathered in the motor pool. Word had spread quickly. Something unusual was happening. Emma stood near a line of Abrams tanks, still covered in desert dust. She had not changed out of her field uniform. There hadn't been time. Blake stood beside her. Ramirez a few steps behind. The battalion formed in loose ranks around them. Colonel Davis stepped forward. We don't often stop operations to acknowledge individual actions. He looked across the formation. But when a single soldier's technical judgment prevents the loss of an entire armored formation, we do. His gaze settled on Emma. Specialist Emma Carter identified a critical system failure before deployment, attempted to prevent it through proper channels, and then restored mobility to this battalion under combat conditions. He paused. This battalion is operational today because of her actions. The words landed differently than Emma expected. Not like praise, like confirmation. Something that had already been proven. After the formation broke, soldiers didn't immediately leave. They lingered near the tanks, near the recovery vehicles, near Emma. At first, it was awkward. Then it wasn't. A young crewman approached her. Ma'am, I was in Alpha 1. We were dead in the water until you got us moving. Emma nodded. You did your job. He hesitated. We thought it was the engine. It wasn't your fault. That seemed to matter more than any official recognition. Sergeant Collins from Echo Company approached next. He stood a little straighter than before. I was wrong about you. Emma looked at him. You weren't the only one. I know, he said. Then, after a pause, thank you for not proving us right. That made her glance down briefly, not because she was uncomfortable, because she understood exactly what he meant. By afternoon, maintenance operations had resumed, but something had changed in how they functioned. When Emma spoke, people listened the first time, not because of rank, not because of authority, because of what they had seen. Sergeant Blake approached her near the tool racks. You planning to stay? Emma tightened a socket wrench in her hand. I haven't thought about leaving. You should. She looked at him. Why? He shrugged slightly. Because command will notice what happened out there. I'm aware. And when they do, things change. Emma didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked across the motor pool. The same tanks, the same heat, the same dust, but not the same people anymore. Finally, she said, I didn't come here for recognition. Blake nodded. I know. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the desert horizon, Emma walked alone between rows of armored vehicles. Engines were cooling. Metal was still ticking softly from heat expansion. She stopped beside one of the Abrams she had repaired under fire, ran her hand lightly across the armor. A crew member inside opened the hatch. You checking on her again? Emma shook her head. No. She looked at the tank. Just making sure she's still alive. The crewman smiled. She got us home. Emma stepped back. Then take care of her. I will. Later, Ramirez found her sitting on the edge of the recovery vehicle. You know what's weird? He said. Emma didn't look up. What? No one's laughing anymore. She finally glanced at him. They learned something. Yeah. He kicked a rock into the sand. Do you think they'll remember? Emma considered that. Then she answered honestly. Some will forget details. Like what? Like seals, temperatures, technical steps. She looked toward the rows of tanks. But they won't forget what it felt like when everything stopped moving, and then started again. Ramirez nodded slowly. That's you. Emma shook her head. No. She stood up. That's the machines doing what they were built to do. She paused, and people finally listening when they spoke. The desert wind picked up again as night settled over Red Mesa. But this time, the silence in the motor pool felt different. Not uncertain, not dismissive, just respectful. And somewhere among the rows of armored vehicles, a mechanic who had once been called the New Girl walked back toward her tools, not as someone trying to prove she belonged, but as someone everyone already knew they could not afford to ignore. And now, this is where Emma Carter's story at Red Mesa comes to an end. What began as doubt, jokes, and quiet dismissal turned into something no one on that desert base will ever forget. In the middle of chaos, she didn't try to prove anyone wrong. She simply did her job better than anyone expected and saved lives because of it. Thank you for staying until the end and following this story with us. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. See you soon in the next story.